Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome you to the second session on SLFRS 16 leases. The objective of today's session is to basically give you a very brief introduction about the requirements of SLFRS 16 leasing standard, which is a relatively new leasing standard. Earlier to SLFRS 16, we used to have LKS 16, which was replaced with effect from 1st of January 2019. So during the discussion today, I will be taking you all through some of the critical changes between the two standards and how SLFRS 16 requires you to review and account for a leasing arrangement from the both lessor's perspective as well as lessee's perspective. And then we will be also going into a discussion of a past paper question just to put things into perspective as to how things can be tested and how you can use your knowledge that you have gathered during the session in order to apply to attempt the specified question tested in the past. So first we'll move on to the overview, a brief introduction about the standard. Actually, like I said earlier, this was replaced back in 1st of January 2019. When SLFRS 16 came into the picture, actually it covered 4 basic areas. It completely replaced LKS 17 leasing standard. And then IFRIC 4, which is relating to determining whether an arrangement contains a lease, SIC 15 operating lease incentives, as well as SIC 27 evaluating the substance of transaction involving the legal form of a lease. So basically SLFRS 16 leases standard built in all of those 4 different adjustments and gives one composite accounting reference as to how you need to account for a leasing agreement. So with the shift of LKS 17, so basically I believe you may be familiar with some of the requirements of LKS 16. Under the requirements of LKS 17, under the LKS 17 standard, you have a requirement to, from both lessors as well as lessee's perspective, you have a requirement to classify the leases into finance lease as well as operating leases. So depending on the transfer of significant risk and rewards, you may classify a lease either as a finance lease or operating lease in line with LKS 17. So as a result of which, under LKS 17, you can see only under the finance leases, you had the assets and liabilities recorded in the balance sheet of the company. Only under the finance leases, you had the assets and liabilities recorded. So if it's a finance lease, you will see the respective assets and liabilities will coming into the balance sheet of the company. If it is an operating lease, the assets and liabilities will be kept off balance sheet. It means it will not be recorded on balance sheet. The operating lease income or the expense, if you are the lessor, the lease income will come into your income statement. If you are the lessee, assets will be off balance sheet and the lease rent will be expensed to your profit and loss statement for the respective period. So for the lessee, what happened was with the introduction of SLFRS 16, so if you look at this perspective, you can see these off balance sheet assets and liabilities now will come and sit on balance sheet. For all leases, you can see for all the leases under SLFRS 16, the right of use asset and the right of use liability will come into the balance sheet, which was earlier kept as off balance sheet item. So one substance or starting point of discussion, please remember under the new accounting standard, for all the leases, right? For all the leases, except for limited exceptions, I will talk about in my latter part of the slides. There are 2 exceptions given in the standard. Except for the exemptions, for all the leases, right of use asset and the liability will be recorded by the lessee. It's not the freehold asset, it's the right of use asset that we account for, which we will discuss in detail. So this is just to give you a very brief summary. And if you look at the income statement, under the previous accounting standard of LKS 17, if it's a finance lease, lessor recognize the lease income, and from the lessee side, you had the depreciation of the asset as well as the finance cost coming in. And if it's an operating lease, lease rental of the lessors went into income, of lessees went into operating cost as a single expense line item. But now on SLFRS 16, so this particular area is covering the SLFRS 16. Now under the SLFRS 16, all your leases, you can see from the lessee standpoint, will have amortization, because you will have depreciation or amortization of the right of use asset, as well as you will have interest expense coming in from the lessee standpoint, because you will have a right of use liability as well. So all the leases you will see under SLFRS 16, which we're accounting, you will have the amortization of the right of use asset as well as the liability. So that's a very brief snapshot of how your balance sheet will change with the introduction of SLFRS 16. So basically, before we move on to the requirements of the standard of SLFRS 16, you have to bear in mind, if you're the lessee, under the requirements of SLFRS 16, you're required to recognize the right of use asset as well as the right of use liability. That's applicable for all the leases, except for the ones which are getting qualified for the exemption. If you're the lessor, the viewpoint is slightly different. If you're the lessor, the standard is consistent with LKS 17. So if you're the lessor, you have to evaluate whether the lessor transfers significant risks to your lessee, to the other counterparty, and then based on which you will classify that as either a finance lease or an operating lease. So we'll discuss those requirements in detail as we move along the slide deck. So let's look at what is the definition of a lease. So this is the theoretical definition which gets covered in the standard. The standard defines a lease as a contract, which technically is an agreement between two or more parties that creates enforceable rights and obligations. So that's a contract. I think we discussed the definition of a contract even when we discussed SLFRS 9 financial instruments. So a lease is a contract or a part of a contract that conveys the right to control the use of an identified asset. So it's important to understand this highlighted word. It's a contract or a part of a contract which conveys the right to control the use of an identified asset for a period of time in exchange for consideration. So basically what it tries to tell you is, if you have an agreement or a part of an agreement which gives you the right to control the use of an identified asset. So it gives you the right to control or use an identified asset for a defined period of time, that gets qualified as a leasing arrangement. So when you look at the definition of a lease, it's important that you have an identified asset. So identified asset meaning the leasing contract should specify what is this asset that is being specifically identified. And you have to have the right to control the use of the asset. So that's important. So right to control the use of the asset. So right to control the use of the asset will have two forms. One, rights to control the use of the asset will have two forms. One is the right to obtain substantially all the economic benefits. So if you have the right to obtain substantially all economic benefits, you say you have the control. Right? So for example, let's say you're leasing a motor car. Right? Let's say you're entering into a leasing arrangement with a counterparty in order to lease a motor car for a period of 2 years. So by using that agreement, if you get the right to control the asset, by using the car to obtain the economic benefits for that period of 2 years, it means you can use the car in any form or fashion, either to generate economic benefits or for the purpose of consumption, that is to use it for your needs. It means you have the right to obtain substantially all the economic benefits. The second condition is right to direct the asset. So control can be of two forms. Either the control can be that you obtain the economic benefits, or it could be that you have the right to direct the use of the asset. You can tell, okay, how to use the asset. You can tell for what purpose the asset will be used. So once you combine both of these conditions, it implies that you may have the right to control the use of the asset. So if you have the right to control the use of the asset and you have an identified asset, that meets the definition of a lease. So let me sum it up again, the definition of a lease in a manner which is much more simpler. For you to have a lease, you need to satisfy two conditions. You have to have an identified asset and you should have the control of the identified asset. For you to have the control of the identified asset, it either should give you the rights to obtain economic benefits, which are substantially all, or you should have the right to direct the use of the asset. So if you have both these conditions, you have the control of the asset. When you have the control of the asset and that asset is identified, that's the definition of a lease. So basically, this is what I elaborated or explained to you earlier. So right to obtain substantially all the economic benefits, meaning the customer can obtain the economic benefits by using, holding, or subleasing the asset. So that's what I said in the example of a vehicle. For a period of 2 years, if you can use that asset for a period of 2 years in a manner in which that pleases you, that meets the definition of substantially rights to receive substantially all the economic benefits of the asset. The right to direct the use of an identified asset, meaning you can tell for what purpose and how to use this particular asset, which is either specified or it could be predetermined. So therefore, once you satisfy these conditions, you will have the right to control the use, which is an important aspect of a lease. So next important area is to understand the lease term. So lease term is generally the non-cancelable period of a lease. So what we generally say the lease term is the period covered in the lease, which technically is the non-cancelable period. So basically in the standard, it explains to say lease term includes the non-cancelable period. It means a period that you cannot cancel either from lessor's perspective or lessee's perspective. So during the non-cancelable period, you can't technically cancel the lease. Option to extend the lease if the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise the option. So it means you have the lease term for a 5-year period, which is non-cancelable. At the end of the 5th year, lessee has an option to extend it for a further term. That's the option to extend it for a further term where lessee is certain to exercise the option. And the third point is option to terminate the lease if the lessee is reasonably certain not to exercise the option. So for example, if you had the 5-year lease, when you determine the lease term, we generally take the non-cancelable period as the lease term. If the agreement contains a clause to say lessee can cancel the lease at the end of the 3rd year, and if lessee is certain that he's not going to exercise the option, then the lease term can be 5 years. So those are critical important aspects of this definition. So we need to understand lease term is the non-cancelable period plus option to exercise or option to extend the period where the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise such options, plus option to terminate where the lessee is reasonably certain not to terminate such options. So technically we are looking at the non-cancelable period where the lease term do exist. The lease payment definition is pretty much similar. I'm just covering up the important definitions before we go into the measurement parts of it, because these are important areas that you need to understand before we go into the measurement. So lease payment generally covers following components. Your fixed rental of the lease is a part of the lease payment. A purchase option, which is option which is there to purchase the asset. It could be a guaranteed option, unguaranteed option. It could be either. Sometimes lease contracts itself carry these purchase options where lessor offers a purchase option either to the lessee or to a third party which could be related or unrelated to the lessee. So for example, let's say you lease the vehicle for a period of 5 years. At the end of the 5th year, lessor can offer a purchase option to lessee to buy the asset. So that's some of the conditions commonly you may find it in lease agreement. Then residual value guarantees. Residual value guarantees are where at the end of the lease term, the asset still carries economic life. And there is a value which is attributable to that economic life. So for example, if it's a vehicle, generally the economic life is about 20-25 years easily. And if you lease the vehicle for 5 years, at the end of the 5 years, there is more value to the vehicle because it can be further used for so many number of years. So the residual value is at the end of the lease term, what value does the lessor fetches from this arrangement? So it means at the end of the 5th year, if I go back to my same example, if you go into a 5-year lease, right? And if you don't offer any purchase options to the lessee, at the end of the 5th year, will lessor have any value attributable to the vehicle? If it's a 5-year vehicle lease, answer for that is yes. Because at the end of the 5th year, if the lease agreement is terminated, lessor have the option to sell this value or sell this asset at the open market at the fair market price. So it means there is a residual value to this asset. So residual value can come in the form of guaranteed residual or unguaranteed residual. That's very important. Guaranteed residual is where a party to the contract or a third party guarantees the value at the end of the period. Sometimes you can have guaranteed residuals also. It means at the end of the lease term, a party to the contract, meaning lessee, or a party, a complete outside party, meaning a party not related to the lessee, can give you a residual value guarantee. So residual value guarantee meaning they will tell at the end of the 5th year, they will buy this vehicle at this particular value. Or it could be unguaranteed residual as well. So unguaranteed residual is where no one guarantees the residual, but we know there's a value to this asset. So at the end of the 5th year, no one guarantees the value for the vehicle, but lessor knows there's a value for this asset which he can sell and realize in the open market. So that's also forms a part of lease payments if you have any guaranteed or unguaranteed residuals. Termination options and penalties. So if you have termination options clauses where there are non-cancelable, to make it non-cancelable, the lessor has put in, those options and penalties also will form an important part of the process. So if you have any termination options, if the termination comes with a penalty, so for example, lessee can terminate the lease before the end of the lease term, but losses incurred by the lessor should be borne by the lessee. So that's a termination clause which combines penalties as well. So we have seen a lot of lease agreements in reality, clauses with termination, we have seen a lot of lease agreements where termination clauses are there, and termination clauses will include and specify the financial penalties also. So if it's a 5-year lease term where the lessee can cancel the lease at any given point in time by giving 3 months notice, for example, agreement itself specifies at the end of the 1st year, if lessee cancels, what's the penalty that lessee have to pay. At the end of the 2nd year, if lessee cancels, what's the penalty that you have to pay. Likewise, for all the 5 years, it discussed the termination option and the corresponding penalty the lessee will have to bear if such termination is triggered. So generally what we have seen in reality, such termination clauses are built in for specialized nature asset. If it's a generic nature asset, there won't be any termination clauses, because for a generic nature asset, if one person cancels the lease, obviously there will be a lot more other potential to be finding another lessee to replace the existing contract. But if it is a very specialized nature assets, such as power plants, etc., you will find very few alternative users. Then when lessor procures an asset to cater to the requirement of the lessee, generally lessor will build in such termination penalties where you make lessee not to exercise such option, because if you exercise, there has to be liquidated damages you have to settle. And then of course the variable lease payments that are depending on a particular index rate where it's linked to CPI, which is Consumer Price Index, or inflation, etc. So those are parts and pieces of lease payments that will get covered under SLFRS 16. So at this point, you're clear about what is the definition of a lease and what is the definition of a lease term as well as a lease payment. Right. So then we'll look at what is the discount rate that you have to use to discount the lease cash flows to arrive at the present value of this lease, because we'll be covering this in detail in the latter part of the slide. But for you to understand what's the discount rate you have to use, standard generally requires you to use the interest rate which is implicit in the lease, which is called IRR. I will explain IRR in detail in my latter part of the slide, but just for time being, keep in mind, if you're discounting the lease cash flows, it's a requirement of the standard that the discount rate has to be the interest rate which is implicit in the lease. If the interest rate which is implicit in the lease is not determinable for practical reasons, you're required to look at the lessee's incremental borrowing rate. So basically the order of hierarchy is, when you're discounting lease cash flows, the first preference should go to interest rate implicit in the lease. And if the interest rate implicit in the lease is not determinable, then you have to consider the lessee's incremental borrowing rate. So if you look at the lessee's incremental borrowing rate, the standard defines that as the rate of interest that a lessee would have to pay to borrow over a similar term and with a similar security. The funds necessary to obtain an asset of a similar value to the right of use asset in a similar economic environment. So in other words, what it tries to tell you is, without entering into a lease on this particular arrangement, if you had to finance this arrangement, it means, for example, without renting a building, if you had to construct or develop a building to have access to the same right of use asset under a similar economic environment, what would be the interest that you have to incur? So that's lessee's incremental borrowing rate. So if you can't determine the interest rate which is implicit in the lease, you then naturally shift to lessee's incremental borrowing rate in order to determine the lease rental, present value of the lease rental. So those are the important aspects that you have to keep in mind. So when it comes to discount rate, please keep in mind the order of hierarchy. You have to look at the implicit rate which is on the lease. If it is not determinable, you come to the incremental borrowing rate. Right. So let's look at with an example how to work out the interest rate implicit in the lease. So when you look at the interest rate implicit in the lease, the definition of interest rate implicit in the lease, which is in short IRR, is the rate at which discounts your minimum lease payment. MLP stands for minimum lease payments, please bear that in mind, is the rate at which discounts the minimum lease payments and unguaranteed or guaranteed residuals to be equal to the fair value of the asset. So in other words, the definition of implicit interest rate is the rate which discounts your lease rental and the unguaranteed residual to be equal to the fair value of the, or the fair value plus the initial direct cost of the asset. So that's the definition of a implicit interest rate. So let's see how to work out the implicit interest rate. Generally at the exam, this will not be expected because generally at the exam, the discount rate will be given for all the practical reasons. IRR may not be required to be calculated because then it has to be a wider question. We will discuss how the IRR is calculated from a examination standpoint, as well as how the IRR is calculated from a practical, more real life standpoint. So there are examples of data which is shared. The fair value of the asset at the inception is 10,000. 5 lease rentals in advance at 2,100. It means if you are the lessor, you purchase the asset at 10,000 rupees and you rent the asset to the lessee for a period of 5 years. Annual rental is 2,100, which is paid in advance. Paid in advance meaning at the beginning of the period, this lease rental will be paid. Lessor's unguaranteed estimated residual value. I think I covered the definition of guaranteed residual as well as unguaranteed residual. So in this case, unguaranteed residual is 1,000 rupees. So what is the implicit interest rate of this lease? If you go back to my definition here, remember implicit rate is the rate which discounts the minimum lease payment and the residual. So residual can be either guaranteed or unguaranteed to be equal to the fair value of that asset plus the initial direct cost. So in other words, in this example, you have to identify the rate which discounts 2,100 and the 1,000. 2,100 and the 1,000 to be equal to the fair value of the asset at the inception, which is 10,000. So in other words, in what rate, if you discount the 2,100 for a period of 5 years in advance paid and 1,000 at the end of the 5th year, at what rate if you discount, you will get to 1,000. So in other words, that's your return of the lease. So that's what you need to calculate. So in practical terms, we are using the Excel function to calculate it, right? To calculate the IRR, we use the Excel function in practical terms. So you have year 0, 1,000, which is the initial fair value or the direct cost. And then you can see the cash flows of 2,100, which is the minimum lease rental, lined up for the period of 5 years. But you can see the first cash flow appearing in year 0. You have to be careful because that is rent in advance. I think under the discounting principles, if the rent is paid in an advance, we always consider n-1. If the rent is paid in arrears, we take n, which is the relevant period. So since the rent is paid in advance, we adjust it as n-1. So year 1 rent, we assume, is paid in year 0. Year 2 rent is assumed to be paid in year 1. That's why the 5th year rent is assumed to be paid in year 4. So that's the adjustment for the rent which is paid in advance. And the unguaranteed residual is 1,500. I think I made a small error here in my example. Please correct it. It should be 1,500, not 1,000, right? I marked this as 1,000, but technically this should be 1,500. It should be 1,500. Please correct that because that's a typo error which has happened. So I am unable to write it on the screen. Please correct it. It should be 1,500. Right. So going back to the example, so unguaranteed residual at the end of the period is 1,500. So in real life, what we do is we net off this cash flow, and year 0, you have a cash outflow of 10,000 because that's the initial investment. You have to purchase the asset at 10,000, and you have the first year rental getting in year 0 because the payment is in advance. So the net cash flow is a 7,900 cash outflow. Then from year 1 to year 4, you will get your other cash flows of 2,100. And in the 5th year, your cash flow is 1,000, right? 5th year cash flow is 1,000. In this case, if I may go back to my earlier slide, so this number is right. It should be 1,000, not 1,500, right? So here, which is right, it is 1,000. But in this case, here we have made a typo here. Please correct that. It should be technically 1,000, right? So which is reflected accurately here. So then for the purpose of determination of IRR, we consider all of these cash flows, right? Year 0, negative 7,900. From year 1 to year 4, you have the 2,100, the rental, and the 5th year, it's the 1,000, which is the unguaranteed residual. So what you do is, in Excel, you have the IRR function. I'll get to the classroom approach as well, but this is just to show you in real life how it works. You go to the IRR function in Excel and you select all these cash flows. And when you select all these cash flows, you can see the answer is given. Your implicit interest rate is 6.62%, 0.06621, meaning as a percentage, that is 6.62%. Then similarly, there's another function in Excel which you can use, rate function. Again, you have to select these items. You have to specify the period. You have to specify the lease rental, initial fair value, unguaranteed residual amount. Type is the mode or the period of the cash flow, whether it's advance or in arrears. So type 1 meaning cash flows are at the beginning of the period or in advance. So you can see it also gives the same answer, 0.621 as the IRR. If you are to calculate the IRR in an example of an examination context, this is the real life. Your real life is much easier with other tools of Microsoft Excel, but unfortunately at the exam, you will not have the help of Microsoft Excel. And at that point, you're required to calculate the IRR using the IRR equation, where you have to have two NPVs, one with a positive NPV and other with a negative NPV, and use the IRR equation, which is obviously the standard equation that you use for financial management learning purposes. We are discounting factor 1 plus NPV1 minus NPV2, NPV1 over the NPV1 minus NPV2 into D2 minus D1. So that's a normal IRR equation that you have to use. Using the IRR equation, you have to identify between a positive NPV and a negative NPV, what is the break-even point. So the break-even point is the point at which your NPV is 0. So if you look at all of these examples that I have given, if you discount this cash flow using 6.621%, your NPV will be absolutely 0. So it's the same logic, but in real life, you're using a little bit of a shortcut in order to calculate the IRR. But in the examination context, if you have to calculate IRR, you have to remember that it's a NPV equation that you're using. You calculate a positive NPV for the cash flows which is given, and then you increase the discount rate and you calculate the negative NPV, and then you put that into the IRR equation and you arrive at the implicit interest rate. Generally, at the exam, this can be tested because it covers certain knowledge of your financial management knowledge as well. But however, chances are discount rates or the implicit interest rate may be given at the exam. If it is not given, if the requirement is to calculate, please keep in mind, you have to work out the manually the IRR for the particular cash flows by considering a positive NPV and a negative NPV. Right. So let's look at how lessees are required to account for these leases. This is on the requirement of lessee accounting. So the requirement for the lessee to account for, there are two recognition exemptions. I told you when I covered this section in advance, that all leases are required to be reflected in the books of lessee as the right of use asset, as the right of use liability. If you may recall, I said there are two exemptions offered in the standard. The two exceptions are short-term leases and low-valued asset. So if your lease term is less than 12 months, that is where the lease term is for a period which is shorter in relative terms, or the asset is a low valued asset. Generally, as per the basis of conclusion in the standard, low value asset is defined as $5,000 US. Remember, this $5,000 US definition has come from the basis of conclusion of the standard. BCs, we call it in short, BCs, basis of conclusion explain. The low valued asset meaning is a $5,000 US or less valued asset. So if your assets are low valued, or if your leases are short term, which is less than 12 months, These are the two recognition exemptions given in the standard. So here you have to be careful for short-term leases. If you have a lease agreement which says lease term is 10 months with the option for the lessee to renew it to a further term, you have to be careful. Then the standard looks at the likelihood of this being renewed. If the lease term is for 10 months, but lessee is absolutely certain this will be renewed for further additional periods, then it may not qualify for short-term leases exemption. You have to be careful there. I would like to take you back to that lease term definition that I discussed with you. Under the lease term, remember we discussed option to extend the lease if the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise such options. So that becomes a part of the lease term. So even if your lease term is less than 12 months, if the lessee carries an option to renew it, and you are absolutely certain this option will be exercised, this may be treated as a lease which is beyond 12 months. Because when you look at the lease term definition, it's the non-cancelable period plus an option to the lessee to extend it to the further term where lessee is certain to exercise such options. So therefore you have to be careful when you read this definition or when you apply this exemption, you have to be mindful these are only applicable for technically less than 12 months leases which are not renewed further time periods. Because otherwise one can structure this as a 12-month renewable basis and qualify for the exemption. It doesn't work that way. You can't do that. So when you say short-term leases, technically it should be less than 12 months. There can't be any renewable option to the lessee where lessee is economically certain to renew it. And when you look at the past pattern, there can't be extensions that are being offered in this lease arrangement for 12 months on a rolling basis. So that's very important when you define the short-term leases. So if there is a short-term lease or a low-valued item, you can exempt that arrangement from SLFRS 16. For all the other leasing arrangements from the lessee standpoint, you have to recognize and measure in line with the requirement of the standard. So now we are going to discuss how to recognize and measure it. For initial recognition and measurement, that's very important. So initial recognition and measurement meaning initially the right of use asset is measured at both asset and the liability. It's very important, this component. Initially the both right of use asset and the liability is measured at present value of the lease payment. I think this part is very important. So initial measurement, day one, right of use asset and the lease liability is measured at the present value of the lease payment. In other words, at day one, you will carry the same value for your right of use asset as well as the liability. That is very important. Day one, you will carry the same value because you're using the present value of the minimum lease payments to derive at your right of use asset. So when you look at the present value, it should immediately ring you a bell. What is the rate you're going to use for present valuing? What's the hierarchy? The hierarchy is first you have to consider the implicit interest rate of the lease. If the implicit interest rate of the lease is not determinable, then you go into the incremental borrowing rate. So that's very important. So as soon as the present value comes into the picture, it should immediately ring a bell to remind you that the present value should be calculated using the implicit interest rate of the lease. Implicit interest rate of the lease is the IRR of the lease. If the implicit interest rate is not determinable, or if it is not given to you at the exam, the information is not there, then you shift to your incremental borrowing rate. Then you shift to your incremental borrowing rate. So that's important. So subsequent measurement of lease liability. So subsequent measurement meaning after the initial measurement at each reporting day. So that's very important. So initial measurement meaning the day that you account for it or enter into the agreement, right? So that's the day that you enter into the agreement. Subsequent measurement is at each reporting date after the initial measurement. So at each reporting date, so depending on a listed company, your reporting dates are quarterly, or it could be any other company, it could be monthly or annually. So at each reporting date, meaning after the initial measurement, at each balance sheet date, how do you need to account for it? So subsequent measurement, we need to keep in mind that the lease liability is accreted meaning you will add the finance cost using the interest rate, either implicit or incremental borrowing rate, whichever you are using. You will accrue the finance cost and you deduct the respective lease payments. That's what you do for the lease liability. I will demonstrate an example in my next couple of slides, right? So remember, for the lease liability subsequent measurement, what you do is you accrue the liability interest. So when you accrue the interest, you debit your P&L. This is from lessee's perspective. It's very important. Keep in mind, not the lessor, right? So when you accrue the interest, you debit the P&L, you credit your liability. And when you make a payment, you set off against the liability. So you credit cash, you debit the liability. That's the double entry for subsequent measurement. So subsequent measurement of the right of use asset. So earlier we discussed subsequent measurement of the lease liability. Depreciation or amortization of the right of use asset generally happens on straight line basis over the shorter of the lease term or the useful life. So basically, the right of use asset will get amortized over the shorter of the lease term or the useful life. So you will credit the right of use asset and you debit your amortization expenses in the P&L. Alternative measurement of right of use asset in line with LKS 16 and LKS 40 investment property, it means you're permitted to fair value. So remember, the subsequent measurement of the right of use asset is performed in line with LKS 16. So under LKS 16, you have cost model as well as revaluation model. So if you go to the revaluation model of accounting for the right of use asset, at every reporting date, you will revalue the right of use asset using a discounted cash flow basis. If you go to the cost approach, right of use asset will be constantly depreciated or amortized, because the scope of the right of use asset for subsequent measurement is taken care of either through LKS 16 or the LKS 40 investment property standard. So for you to account the right of use asset under LKS 40, remember it has to meet the definition of investment property, where the said property is held for the purpose of capital appreciation or earning of rental income. So you have to be mindful that not all right of use assets you can designate under investment property. Only those ones which you earn rental income, which means you are subleasing that, yes, that can be specified under LKS 40 investment property. So those are the measurement requirements for a lessee. Just to quickly wrap it up, please keep in mind initial measurement. You recognize both right of use asset and the liability at the same amount or the same value, which is the present value of your lease payment. So when you say present value, you discount either using the implicit rate or the incremental borrowing rate. Subsequent measurement of the liability, there are two important components. You have to add the finance cost because it's a liability, a finance liability. So you have to add the finance cost and you set off the payments against the liability. Subsequent measurement of the right of use asset will be either in line with LKS 16 property, plant and equipment or LKS 40 investment property. Remember, for you to push it under LKS 40 investment property, it needs to meet the definition of a investment property. If not, subsequent measurement, if it comes under LKS 16, you have the option of cost model as well as revaluation model. If it's the cost model, you depreciate or amortize the right of use asset over the shorter of the lease term or the useful life of the right of use asset. So those are a very summary of how a lessee requires to account for a lease. So let's put some numbers to add things into the perspective. Just a classroom example. Let's say a lessee enters into a 3-year lease of equipments. Lease term is for a period of 3 years. Annual lease payments, year 1 to year 3. Year 1 rental is 10,000, year 2 12,000, year 3 14,000. Discount rate is given for you 4.235%. And present value of the minimum lease payment is also given, which is 33,000. How this 33,000 was derived was discounting the year 1, year 2, and year 3 cash flows using 4.235%. So the present value of the lease payment will be 33,000. So let's see how you are accounting for it. So if you look at the balance sheet first, let's take this piece first. If you look at the balance sheet, initial measurement, you account for the right of use asset 33,000 as well as the corresponding liability. So your double entry for initial measurement, debit right of use asset 33,000, credit lease liability 33,000. How did you get this 33,000? That's your present value of your future cash flows, which is these cash flows. Basically, you have present value using 4.235. I'm not going to talk about the present value function because that is straightforward. You are covering that through other curriculums, how to present value your future cash flow. So I'm not going to talk about that in detail. So initial measurement in first year, your double entry would be debit right of use asset 33,000 and you credit your lease liability 33,000, right? So that's covered and that's straightforward, which you have already booked. Then after the initial measurement, next question is what is going to happen between year 1 to year 3? That's what we're going to demonstrate here. So basically your lease liability will unwind. When I say unwind, on 33,000, you will accrue interest at 4.235%, right? This is your interest rate. So at 33,000, you accrue interest at 4.235, which is 1,398, which you debit your P&L and you credit your liability, right? And then in the first year, there is a settlement which comes in. Year 1 cash flow is 10,000. So you deduct 10,000 from this. So basically you add the interest cost and you deduct 10,000. Then the year 2 lease liability will be 24,391, which you are here, right? And then for the second year, your interest cost will be, you're adding 4.235% on 24,398, which becomes 1,033. Again, you will debit the P&L and you credit your liability. And then in the second year, a payment of 12,000 goes off from the liability. So then the third year balance of the liability will be 13,431. On 13,431, you apply 4.235%, which gives you an interest expense of 569. You debit your P&L, credit the liability, and final payment of year 3 will happen for 14,000, exactly making the balance to be 0. So that is the expense that you see in your P&L relating to your liability. So these are your payments. You're making a 10,000 payment in year 1 and 12,000 payment in year 2 and 14,000 payment in year 3. So those are the payments that you make in reference to the liability, right? So basically a creation of the liability, meaning you simply add your interest for year 1, year 2, and year 3, and you deduct the respective payments. Then you arrive at these closing balance of the liability, right? Then if you look at right of use asset, initial measurement 33,000, that's clear, which is accounted as the present value of the minimum lease payment. And thereafter what happens, you amortize your right of use asset on straight line basis. I told you it's under LKS 16. If you are opting for the cost model, you will amortize it over the shorter of lease term or the useful life. So in this case, 33,000 gets amortized on a straight line basis, which is 11,000 a year over the period of the 3 years, right? Over the period of the 3 years. So 11,000 into 3, 33,000. You can see the balance drops to 22,000 and in the final year, the balance will drop to 0. So that's how the lessee's accounting for a lease will happen initially as well as subsequently. Right. So let's move on to lessor's accounting. So lessee side, it's very clear there's only one model that you account for. The standard have simplified. There are no operating lease, finance lease distinction. Lessee will only account for one method, which is the right of use asset. All leases which are not qualifying for exemptions under short term or low valued items, you will account for the right of use asset as well as the right of use liability. So there's particularly one accounting model for the lessee. But for the lessor, the situation or the fact pattern is slightly different. There's two models which is consistent with LKS 17, which was similar to LKS 17. For the lessor, you're required to evaluate whether it's a finance lease or it's an operating lease. So how do we define whether it's a finance lease or operating lease? Lessor required to perform the evaluation whether substantially all the risks and the rewards incidental to the ownership is transferred. So lessor, by virtue of the lease, transfers all the risk and rewards incidental to the ownership of the underlying asset. You classify that as a finance lease. If not, you classify that as operating lease. So how do we measure whether the lease transfers significant or substantial risk and rewards which are incidental to the ownership of the asset? There are 5 criteria which is given, as well as few additional criteria in the standard. The first one is whether the lease transfers ownership of the asset to the lessee. So if the lease transfers ownership of the asset to the lessee at the end of the contract period, we can assume the substantial risk and rewards are transferred. The second point, the lessee has the option to purchase the asset at a price expected to be sufficiently lower than the fair value of the asset. So if the lessee has a purchase option to buy the asset at a price which is lesser than the market value of the asset, and it becomes exercisable, and lessee is reasonably certain you're going to exercise that option, it has characteristics of a finance lease. If you look at the substance, why does the standard structures it to say lessee has the option to purchase the asset at a price expected to be lower than its fair value? Why would a lessor allow a lessee in an economic arrangement to purchase an asset below the market price? Only way in which the lessor will allow it, during the cash flows of the lease term, lessor have recovered the cost of the asset with an adequate return. So during the cash flows of the lease term, if the lessor have already realized the value, cost of the asset, which are adequate compensation or return, thereafter you're selling or disposing at a lower than the fair value is not an economic concern of the lessor. So in other words, if you satisfy the second condition, it means through pricing, lessor is realizing the value of the asset by way of recoveries of the lease cash flows. The third term is lease term is for the major part of the economic life of the asset, even if the title is not transferred. So if the lease term is structured to the entirety of the economic life of the asset, even if the legal ownership is not transferred, it doesn't really matter. Lessee will be the beneficiary of this asset by virtue of the lease agreement. So therefore, that also implies that significant risk and rewards are transferred to the lessee. At the inception date, the present value of the lease payment amounts to at least substantially all the fair value of the leased asset. So that's an important assessment. You're trying to see in present value terms whether the present value of the lease payment is substantially all the fair value of the asset. In other words, whether you are recovering the cost of the asset. That's what you're trying to do. So this fourth point and the second point coincides. Usually, if you allow the purchase option to the lessee to purchase at a lower than the fair value at the end of the lease term, generally criteria 4 will also be met. In other words, when you present value the cash flows, you will realize that the present value of the lease rental is substantially all the fair value of the leased asset. In other words, lessor have recovered the cost of the asset during this lease agreement. Because if you're the lessor, put yourself into the shoes of the lessor. If you're recovering the cost of the asset with an adequate return, thereafter, you don't have interest over the asset because you have fully recovered the value of the asset and the lessee have paid for the value of the asset. So generally, the risk will be with the person who pays for the asset. So that's why I said the second and the fourth points are generally coinciding. Then the fifth point, asset is of a such specialized nature that only lessee can use it without major modifications. So that is where you're looking at a very specialized nature asset. Only lessee is capable of using it. It means lessee would also not want to cancel this lease. And if you're the lessor, you will also find it difficult to find an alternate customer to lease this asset. Therefore, you will put lock-on clauses. You will ensure the value of this asset is generally recovered through the lessee. So due to these clauses or conditions are satisfied, if either one or in combination, the standard uses the term, if these conditions in isolation or in combination. So you don't need to satisfy all, even if you satisfy one, that triggers the finance lease. But if you really look at it, if it transfers the ownership, technically all these other conditions will be met. Why does the lessor transfers the ownership? Because technically lessee pays the right price during the lease agreement. Why would you allow the purchase of option at a price which is lesser than the fair market value? Because lessee paid the right price and the return on the asset. If you provide a majority of the economic life of the asset under a lease term, obviously then only the lessee would benefit. At the inception, if you are certain the present value of your lease rental would cover the cost of the asset with an adequate return, it means already lessee have paid for the asset. So if you look at the evaluation process, it's quite simple. What you're trying to do is you're trying to see whether lessee financially accepted the responsibility on this asset. If the lessee have financially accepted the responsibility of the asset and you're transferring the legal ownership, then it carries characteristics of a finance lease. So that's the evaluation that you're required to perform when you're evaluating from the lessor's perspective, whether the lease is a finance lease or an operating lease. Right. So let's look at lessor's accounting for a finance lease. So this is from the lessor's perspective. Lessor will account for the finance lease under the net investment of a lease. So you will have to recognize the lease by the lessor's books at the net investment. Net investment meaning gross investment discounted at the implicit interest rate. So let's look at what is a gross investment in the lease. Gross investment in the lease is the minimum lease payment receivable by the lessor under a finance lease, and it's not or, it's and meaning including any unguaranteed residual accruing to the lessor. So basically what the standard tells you is the lessor of a finance lease should recognize the finance lease receivable at the present value of the minimum lease payment and unguaranteed residual. So at the present value of the minimum lease payment and unguaranteed residual is the price at which the lessor should recognize the lease in the books of the lessor. So under the finance lease, you have to keep in mind lessor will not book the asset. Instead, the lessor will only recognize the lease receivable, the finance lease receivable, which is accounted as the present value of the minimum lease payment and the unguaranteed residual. So those are the important components from the lessor standpoint when you're accounting for the finance lease. So let's put some numbers, which is similar to the early example that I gave you or I shared with you. Details of the non-cancelable lease are as follows. So the fair value of the asset is 10,000 at the inception. 5 annual rentals which are payable in advance, 2,100. So that's a rent which is paid in advance, and lessor's unguaranteed residual at the end of the period of the 5 years, 1,000 rupees. So basically lessor invests in an asset which has a value of 10,000 and the 5 rentals payable in advance 2,100. Again, I'll remind you, when you say rentals paid in advance, it's always n-1 when you look at the discounting. Lessor's unguaranteed residual is 1,000. Implicit interest rate of the lease is given 6.62%. Again, it should ring a bell, the hierarchy. If the implicit rate is given, you use the implicit rate. If it is not, you use the incremental borrowing rate, right? From lessor's standpoint, it's important that you use the implicit interest rate at all times. From the lessee standpoint, there can be practical limitations where the lessee is not visible to the implicit interest rate. In such circumstances, you have to use the incremental borrowing rate, right? So in this case, the implicit rate is given, which is 6.62%. The gross investment in the lease. So using the example, we look at the gross investment in the lease. The gross investment of the lease is the accumulated lease rentals, which is 2,100 into 5. So 2,100 into 5 accumulated lease rentals are 10,500 plus the unguaranteed residual of 1,000. The total gross lease rental or gross investment in this case will become 11,500 rupees, right? 11,500 rupees. It's important. And the gross earnings, unearned income is 1,500. So the net investment will be the 11,500, which you discount at 6.62%. Then your net investment of the lease will be 10,000 rupees. So always bear in mind, when you discount your gross investment, which is 11,500, which is built up of 5 cash flows of 2,100 received in advance, and the unguaranteed residual received at the end of the 5th year, which is 1,000. When you discount it by 6.62%, always you end up with 10,000, which is your initial direct cost or fair value of the asset. So then from the lessor standpoint, you will book the 10,000 as the long-term lease receivable. You will not book the asset. And the long-term lease receivable thereafter will be accounted for respectively. There will be finance income for the lessor, as well as the lease payment gets amortized over the period of the time. So 10,000 will be created in terms of interest at 6.62, which will go into finance income. And then the lease rental, when the 2,100 is settled, it goes against the outstanding receivable. So that's how the accounting will happen from the lessor's standpoint. So if I may quickly demonstrate this using example in Excel, because the numbers then will be much. Let's work out the numbers that we discussed. So you have initial fair value of 10,000. So basically initial fair value, generally we have the period. Initial fair value generally is year 0. That's the investment point. So generally we take the initial fair value as year 0. And thereafter you have cash flows which are coming in relating to 5-year period. So cash flows, initial fair value is 10,000. Minimum lease payments 2,100 a period. So there will be 5 years that you will receive 2,100, but we will reflect the 5th year as the 4th year because it's n-1 for discounting purposes. And at the end of the 5th year, you have 1,000 as the unguaranteed residual. So basically, when you work out your net cash flows, in year 1, you have negative 7,900, and subsequent years you will have these respective cash. So IRR in this question is given as 6.21, but if I may calculate it quickly using the IRR function, only thing that I do is I select the cash flows, but ensure that you don't leave any space in between, because when you leave any space in between, Excel will start picking that as additional period where there is no cash flow, then your IRR will get impacted. So always ensure these cash flows are attached to one after the other consecutive cash flow. So you can see your IRR becomes 6.621, right? So then what happens is your lessor should recognize the initial lease rental at the amount of the gross investment, sorry, at the amount of the net investment in the lease. So net investment in the lease is where your gross investment is counted at the effective interest rate or the implicit interest rate, which is 6.62%. So let's look at the cash flows. So basically, if you look at the lease cash flows, minimum lease payment, you would be receiving 2,100 in year 0. It's important to understand because the cash flow is in advance, we're considering n-1. So first year cash flow n-1, meaning 1 minus 1 will be 0. That's why I'm putting 2,100 as 0 under the 0 period. Second year cash flow will be assumed to be received in the first year because it's n-1. So second year cash flow, my n is 2 minus 1 will be 1. So likewise, my 5-year cash flows will be, for discounting purposes, we consider that as n-1. And at the end of the 5th year, we have the 1,000 rupees which is received. So discounting factor will be at 6.2162%. So I will calculate the discounting factor using the discounting factor equation, 1 divided by 1 plus R. R is the implicit interest rate in this point, to the power n is the period. You can see my discounting factor in year 0 is 1. That's a normal rule of thumb in present valuing cash flows. And then I'll calculate the respective discounting factor, and then arrive at the present value of the cash flows. So this is exactly the value of the net investment in the lease, which the lessor will book at the inception, which is 10,000. So you can see in my answer, I have suggested to be accounted at 10,000. How I got the 10,000? By discounting these cash flows of the lease using the implicit rate in the lease. So then thereafter, how accounting will have to happen. So lessor will have the double entry, debits lease receivable 10,000, credit the asset because you have to derecognize the respective asset which was recorded at the initial direct cost. So credit the asset. Generally, your direct cost is equal because you have identified your asset at 10,000. Therefore, you credit the asset at 10,000. If there is a differential value, gain or a loss, you have to adjust it through the profit or loss statement. If there is a, for example, let's say the asset value is 9,000. Technically, it can be when you're working out the IRR, but if your asset value is 9,000, then there will be a gain of 1,000 or a loss likewise, so which you have to account for. And the subsequent accounting for the lessor, needs to happen. Now this 10,000 that you're booking in, you have to build the amortization table, right? So you have the period, opening balance, payment, net balance, interest. So the period of the lease will be 5 years. Opening balance is the net receivable which you're booking at 10,000. Remember, the payment is in advance, so you have to deduct the payment. So payment comes first before you calculate the net balance. So payment will be in advance. And at the end of the 5th year, you will have the residual value, which is coming in. And then the net amount will be that the interest will be calculated on the net amount at 6.621. And the closing balance will be at the end of the first year, 8,413. 8,413 will be the second year opening. Similarly, you work out your closing balance until the end of the 5th year. So now you can see it stops at 1,000 because this 1,000 is the unguaranteed residual, right? So at the end of the lease term, the 5th year, the lessor implies there's an unguaranteed residual of 1,000. So it means lease receivable will come to 1,000 and stop at 1,000. At that point, the lessor can bring in the value of the asset back to the books at 1,000. That's why this calculation method is important. What you do here is, I will explain what I did here. You deducted the payment first because it's the payment is in advance. Remember, whether the cash flow is in advance or arrears, it will dictate how you require to adjust the cash flows, how you require to adjust the cash flows. If your payment is in advance, first you need to deduct the cash flow. If the payment is in arrears, you accrue the interest, then you deduct. So in this case, you first deduct the payment because it will be paid at the beginning of the period, and interest will be calculated only on the net balance. So this interest component to the income of the lessor as finance income, finance interest income. So in the first year, you will have a finance income of 523, second year 418. You can see likewise, it will be accrued. The payment will be offsetted against the receivable balance. So double entry for this interest receivable will be you debit your lease receivable, you credit your income, and when the cash comes in from the lessor, you debit your cash, credit your lease receivable. So that's double entry that you require to perform. So at the end of the 5th year, you can see it exactly stops at 1,000. It won't be 0 because that's the unguaranteed residual. It means lessor anticipated when he structured the transaction. If you read the question carefully, at the end of the 5th year, there is an unguaranteed residual of 1,000. It means once the lease is terminated, the lessor will get the asset back at the end of the 5th year at the value of the 1,000. So that's why in this calculation, it stops at 1,000 so that you can reclassify the receivable into a asset. If you're going to take that asset back from the lessor standpoint, you can reclassify that asset back again to your books. That's why it exactly stops at the 1,000 by 5th year. So that summarizes how you require to account for the finance lease from the books of the lessor. Right, so we can continue forward, move forward. We discussed all that. Lessor's accounting under the operating lease is the next section. So lessor's accounting under the operating lease is very straightforward. Lessor will continuously account for the asset under the operating lease in line with LK 16 property, plant and equipment. The lease income from the operating lease will be recognized into your income statement, your P&L using straight line basis, straight line method, unless there is another systematic basis is applicable or relevant. So basically, you take your income on straight line from the perspective of the lessor. depreciation of the asset, because now physical asset is in the books of the lessor, will be inconsistent with LK 16 if it is a tangible asset, or LK 38